If you're dealing with a narcissist, there's something Carl Jung discovered about human psychology that will completely change how you see this relationship, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why everything you've been trying has been failing. According to Carl Jung, every human being carries what he called the shadow, the hidden, repressed aspects of personality that we refuse to acknowledge. But here's what Jung discovered that most people miss: narcissists have weaponized their shadow. They don't just hide from it, they project it onto you. When you're engaging with a narcissist, you're not operating in the same psychological reality. Carl Jung said that true relationship requires what he called individuation, the development of authentic self-awareness. But narcissists? They've abandoned this journey entirely. They're not interested in mutual respect, reciprocity, or shared understanding. Their game is entirely different. And here's where it gets dangerous. Because what I'm about to tell you about their primary goal will explain every confusing interaction you've ever had with them. A narcissist's primary objective isn't connection, it's control. Carl Jung discovered that some individuals become so disconnected from their authentic self that they can only feel real through domination of others. If that means distorting reality, they'll do it without hesitation. If it means gaslighting you into questioning your own perceptions, they'll execute it like a master strategist. Now, here's where most people make a critical error, and Carl Jung himself warned about this. They assume that showing enough kindness, patience, or clear explanation will eventually break through to the narcissist's authentic self. But Jung discovered something crucial: some people have so thoroughly abandoned their authentic self that traditional approaches to human connection simply don't work. But there's a way to see through their manipulation. And it starts with understanding these 3 psychological tactics that Jung identified in his work on the human psyche. Tactic 1, the reality distortion. Carl Jung said that our perception of reality is deeply personal and subjective. Narcissists exploit this principle through what Jung would recognize as projection. They make you doubt your own psychological reality. They deny conversations that happened, rewrite history so subtly that you find yourself apologizing for things you never did. The more you engage in these reality-checking arguments, the more control they gain. Because according to Jung's principles, the very act of defending your perception places you in a subordinate psychological position. And here's the most insidious part: they've actually created a psychological addiction in your mind, and Jung's research on the human psyche explains exactly how this works. Tactic 2, the intermittent reinforcement. Carl Jung discovered that human beings are naturally driven toward wholeness and completion. Narcissists corrupt this drive by alternating between affection and cruelty in unpredictable cycles. Jung would recognize this as a perversion of the natural human need for connection. If someone is consistently cruel, you detach. But when they occasionally provide moments of warmth, your psyche starts chasing that reward, hoping that the good version of them will emerge permanently. This creates what Jung would call a complex, a psychological dependency that keeps you trapped. Tactic 3, the shadow projection. Carl Jung said that we often see in others what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. Narcissists weaponize this by accusing you of exactly what they're guilty of. If they're dishonest, they'll call you a liar. If they're emotionally unstable, they'll claim you're irrational. But here's what Jung discovered about breaking free from these psychological traps. And this might be the most important thing you hear today. Once you recognize these patterns, you stop playing their game. And according to Jung's understanding of psychological dynamics, when you stop playing, they lose their power entirely. One of the most self-destructive patterns you can fall into, and Carl Jung wrote extensively about this, is seeking validation from someone who is psychologically incapable of providing it. Jung called this living in the shadow of another person's psychology. When you modify your behavior to avoid their criticism or gain their acknowledgement, you're essentially abandoning what Jung called your authentic self. You're allowing them to dictate your psychological reality. And here's the cruel truth that Jung discovered about these psychological dynamics: the validation you're seeking will never come, and I'll explain why in a moment. Carl Jung said that individuals who haven't completed their psychological development are trapped in what he called perpetual projection. They cannot allow themselves to be wrong because it would shatter their fragile psychological structure. They cannot truly see or appreciate others because that would mean relinquishing control. The goalposts are always moving because the game was never designed to be winnable. According to Carl Jung, the path to psychological freedom involves what he called withdrawing projections. You must stop looking to them for approval in any form. This doesn't mean cruelty, it means removing yourself from their psychological game entirely. So how does this actually work in real life? Jung's approach gives us 3 specific strategies that will immediately change your dynamic with them. Strategy 1. Stop justifying yourself. Carl Jung said that when you defend yourself against projection, you're actually strengthening the projector's power. A narcissist thrives on argument because argument implies their opinion matters. The moment you start defending yourself, you've entered their psychological territory. Strategy 2. Abandon the closure myth. Jung discovered that some people are psychologically incapable of genuine reflection or accountability. That moment where they acknowledge their wrongdoing, it's not coming. And Jung would say that waiting for it keeps you trapped in their psychological web. But here's where Jung's insights become truly powerful, because when you understand this next principle, you become psychologically untouchable. Strategy 3. Redefine your validation source. Carl Jung said that true psychological health comes from what he called self-acceptance, deriving your worth from your own authentic self rather than external validation. If you've spent years adjusting your self-perception to fit someone who cannot value you, it's time to reclaim that power. Here's what Carl Jung understood about psychological warfare: assuming that fairness will protect you from someone operating outside normal psychological parameters is a dangerous mistake. Jung would say that narcissists exist in a completely different psychological framework. And this is where most people get it completely wrong. They think being the bigger person will eventually lead to a breakthrough. But Jung's research reveals why this approach actually makes you more vulnerable. To a narcissist, your willingness to keep explaining, keep justifying, keep hoping for rational response isn't strength, it's weakness. It tells them they still control your psychological state. Carl Jung understood that some psychological situations require what he might call protective withdrawal. This is where the gray rock technique becomes powerful, making yourself psychologically uninteresting to the narcissist. Jung would recognize this as removing yourself from their projection field. When you refuse to provide the emotional reactions they crave, they lose their psychological leverage. But here's the most powerful thing Jung discovered about these psychological dynamics, and this is what will set you completely free. According to Carl Jung, the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. When you reach genuine psychological indifference toward their provocations, you become what Jung would call psychologically sovereign. A narcissist cannot control what they cannot provoke. When they realize they no longer have the ability to manipulate your emotional state, they lose interest entirely. Carl Jung said that psychological boundaries are not about controlling others, they're about controlling your own psychological space. A narcissist will never respect boundaries unless you enforce them through action, not words. And here's what Jung's research predicted would happen when you start enforcing real boundaries. They will escalate dramatically, and most people fail at this exact moment. When a narcissist realizes their usual psychological tactics aren't working, they create what Jung would recognize as an extinction burst, a final, desperate attempt to regain psychological control. This is when the accusations, guilt, and manipulation intensify. But Jung discovered that if you can weather this storm without breaking your own psychological boundaries, something remarkable happens: they lose their grip on you entirely. Here's the hardest truth Carl Jung ever discovered about human psychology: some people are fundamentally incapable of genuine self-reflection. That apology you're waiting for, that moment of accountability, Jung would tell you it's not coming. But here's what Jung discovered about true psychological freedom, and this will completely change how you see your entire situation. Carl Jung said that healing doesn't require the other person's participation. You can reclaim your psychological narrative without their validation. You can achieve what Jung called psychological wholeness by deciding that their opinion of you is irrelevant to your self-worth. According to Carl Jung, the less you need validation from someone, the more psychological power you have over your own life. The moment you stop seeking their approval, you become what Jung called psychologically self-sufficient. Carl Jung discovered that the most powerful response to psychological manipulation isn't anger or confrontation, it's thriving independently. When you live a life so full, so autonomous, so unshackled from their influence that they become nothing more than a distant memory, you've achieved what Jung called individuation. And that's when something truly remarkable happens, something Jung predicted about human psychology that will amaze you. The weight they placed on your psyche begins to lift. The anger, confusion, and self-doubt start to fade. Not because what they did was acceptable, but because you've chosen to no longer let it define your psychological reality. In the end, Carl Jung would say that the greatest victory against a narcissist isn't proving them wrong, it's proving to yourself that you no longer need their validation. It's achieving psychological independence so complete that they become irrelevant to your emotional well-being. That is real closure. That is true freedom. And that is the path Jung discovered leads to authentic psychological wholeness. Because according to Carl Jung, the moment you stop needing them to see you and start seeing yourself clearly, that's when you've won the only battle that ever truly mattered. If this resonated with you, there's more Jung wisdom that can transform how you handle difficult people. But the question is, are you ready to implement these psychological insights, or will you go back to the old patterns that keep you trapped? Thank you so much for staying with me through this exploration. If you found value in today's discussion, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who might benefit from it.